Our next speaker is Kimball Garrett. Kimball is the Ornithology Collection Manager at the LA County Museum of Natural History. He is co-author of lots of really important books, including warblers, including status and distribution of LA County birds, et cetera. And most importantly, he loves to share his knowledge and experience with wannabes like Mark and I, and a few of you out there also. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kimball Garrett.
Okay, did I remember to unmute myself? I hope so. Otherwise, I hope you can read lips. All right. Anyway, it's great to, well, I don't see you guys, but it's great if I could see you guys, and great to get together. We've had various ways of birders sort of getting together on a regular basis in LA County, and we've all missed being able to do that. And I really thank Mark and Ron and everybody else involved with putting this together for allowing us to do it at least in some fashion. And I think this is going to prove to be a very good way to share information and present just interesting things about LA County birds and research and so on. So I hope we keep doing this for as long as possible. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a bird that I'm sure all of you very much enjoy seeing when you do, which is the Vermilion Flycatcher. And it's no news to any of you, I'm sure, that there seem to be a lot of Vermilion Flycatchers around. Way back when, many decades ago, when I was lusting after getting a life Vermilion Flycatcher, the place we all went was Morongo Valley, go out to Covington Park. This was like the late 1960s. And sure enough, there'd be a pair of Vermilion Flycatchers. And that was like virtually the only ones accessible in California, and really pretty exciting to see. And now I wouldn't say they're getting to be trash birds, but they're certainly expanding their range and numbers. So we wanted to talk about that a little bit, talk about the species, and also kind of address the question, whenever we see a big increase in birds, is it because there's a lot more of them? Are they expanding? Or is it because there's a lot more of us as birders that are scouring every nook and cranny? Our numbers are growing, our efficiency is growing, and particularly our ability to get information about sightings into the record and to let others know about it has increased tremendously. And so you always want to ask the question, is it because there's more birds, or is it because there's more of us? Mark sort of brought that up about neotropic cormorants in terms of their spread, but that's, I think, a very clear-cut case where a bird just wasn't here before. And even if there were only 20 birders in LA, I think we'd be noticing an increase there. So we'll explore that a little bit. So I've sort of whimsically titled this, Who Has Exploded, Vermilion Flycatchers, Birders, or Both? And then remember, of course, we have the Q&A function if you've got questions. And we may wait till toward the end of the end of the presentation to actually answer them, but we're happy to do that. So,
and I'm sorry, Kimball.
First thing to take care of. Yes.
If I can interrupt 1 second, just to let everyone know, Kimball kind of has a little bit slower a connection, so you may not see him as I see him. But just to let you know, he's looking very distinguished tonight. He kind of he has this kind of waviness about his hair and all that. It's really, you know, if he wasn't a married man, I'm sure he'd be out. He's actually taking care of sprucing out right now.
Enough.
Can I interrupt for 1 second, too?
Yes,
Some
go ahead.
people on the chat are saying that they're seeing Ron and not Kimball for video.
Right, and that's just what I was addressing.
Okay, it's because of that. Okay.
Yeah, because I think he has a little bit slower connection. We apologize, and we'll take it from there. Go ahead, Kimball.
I'm out here in the boondocks of Juniper Hills with a terrible HughesNet internet connection. If you can't see me, consider yourself lucky. I wanted to start with a spelling lesson. This is one of the most frequently misspelled bird names, I think, of all North American birds. The upper word is correct, Vermilion. The bottom word, Vermilion, is a city in South Dakota. It's also an alternative spelling for the color, but not one that is generally accepted. So please, you can make bird books shorter and make North American birds shorter and everything else shorter by only putting one L in vermilion when you write it down. So if you don't learn anything else tonight, take that one home with you. So Pyrocephalus rubinus, the vermilion flycatcher, is a very widespread bird in the New World. Maybe not really as widespread as this eBird map would suggest, since these are essentially all vagrant records out in eastern North America. But you can see basically from southwestern United States through Mexico, with something of an interruption in the southern part of Central America, and then through much of South America as well. So it's a very widespread bird, but we're pretty much at the northwestern extreme of their range. Just to get into a little more detail here, there are a number of described subspecies of vermilion flycatchers, but more importantly, they fit into several distinct groupings, which some have suggested might even be distinct at these level. So the most distinctive ones, actually divergent, are the two taxa in the Galapagos Islands, a widespread subspecies Nanus, and then Nubius, which is limited to San Cristobal Island, and very rare now, if not extinct. So those are quite distinct and probably would be split at the species level. Then you have the northern group, or the Mexicanus group, which is, of course, what we have. You have the far southern nominate group, that's Rubinus rubinus, and so that's interesting because it's highly migratory, moving from southern, even temperate South America to spend the winter in the Amazon. You have another group, Saturatus, on the Caribbean coast of northern South America, and finally the Obscurus group on the west coast of South America. So these four distinct mainland groups, plus two on the Galapagos, pretty much describe the geographical variation in vermilion flycatchers. Basically, the males mostly all look alike, some minor differences. Females are a little more variable among subspecies groups. One interesting thing is in Obscurus, many of the individual males are very dark, kind of a sooty color rather than red. I'll show you a picture of one a little bit later. So that's the basic species. This has been a bird of conservation concern for quite a while in California, and the first California bird species of special concern volume that Van Remsen authored or edited in 1978, it was considered a species of special concern of the highest priority, very localized and thought to be declining. The species of special concern list was redone in 2008. Dave Shuford and Tom Gardali were the main editors there. And it was still on the list, although priority 2 rather than the highest priority. So this is a bird, despite what we'll be talking about in the rest of the talk, has been one of great conservation concern. If you look at the historical literature, and that's something we should all do all the time because it's great to trace the development of our knowledge about every bird. Grinnell and Miller kind of summarized what was the case up to that point when it was published in 1944, and there's of course some older literature, but basically they were common in the Colorado River Valley and a few up into the Imperial and Coachella valleys. There actually were a couple outlying breeding records in the upper Mojave River drainage, so roughly sort of Victorville region. And we also knew they were somewhat migratory, so you tend to get more birds in the coastal areas in the wintertime, even though they weren't known to breed there. I call this the early birding period, when birders were still kind of trying to figure out what was what, but post-dating Grinnell and Miller and a lot of the historical ornithology. And during this period, there were certainly declines on the Colorado Desert and breeding sites that expanded a little bit northwest to Morongo Valley. As I mentioned before, that's where a lot of us old timers got our life birds way back when, say in the 1960s at Covington Park in Morongo Valley. I call this the pre-eBird birding period, because birding, of course, had really taken off by the 1980s, really the 1970s, but into the 1980s, up to the advent of eBird in the early 2000s. And during this period, LA County saw its first nesting records. Dick Erickson found a breeding pair in the Leona Valley, which is kind of in the hills west of Palmdale, in 1994. And then during the LA County Breeding Bird Atlas effort, Mike San Miguel found a breeding pair at a ranch yard north of Lancaster, almost up at the Kern County line. And during this period, there was also some expansion up into the San Bernardino area on the coastal slope, as far north as the South Fork of the Kern River, into the interior of San Diego County, although Phil Unit notes that there were declines after about the mid-1980s in that area, and even as far northwest as the Cuyama Valley up in Santa Barbara County, and also, in addition to San Bernardino, coastal nestings around Irvine. So you can see some expansion in that kind of pre-eBird birding period. In the California Bird Species of Special Concern document, let me just get rid of all these faces here that are covering up my slides so I can see what I wrote. Steve Myers did the species account for Vermilion Flycatcher, and he said something kind of interesting. Although with range expansion, the species has occupied parks, campgrounds, golf courses, and developed areas, continued decline suggests that these habitats are poor substitutes for natural riparian. So whether that turned out to be true or not, we'll talk about. The biggest threats that were identified in the species of special concern document were the loss and degradation of natural riparian habitats, exacerbated by the lowering of groundwater tables and flood control activities. Brown-headed cowbird parasitism was not really implicated as a problem, although they have parasitized for millions. It doesn't seem to be real common. But this millennium, something seems to have changed and the species has expanded. So something's clicked in Vermilion flycatchers. And I want to look at sort of three just periods that I just sort of defined so I could have three equal 6-year periods. So we're going to look at the earliest advent of eBird up through about 2008, then a middle period, and then the last 6 years, including this year. So if you look way back at that first period, 2003 to 2008, and look in LA County, basically you had this. Now these are only May through August sightings, so I'm pretty much trying to restrict it to breeding season. So you see a few in the Inland Empire, this one sighting in Madrona Marsh. That's basically it for LA County. So obviously things were a bit different back then. If you continue to the next 6 years, from 2009 to 2014, you see it's starting to fill in a little bit. You got Hahamongna here. You have, I believe, the Santa Fe Dam area. You've got a couple sightings out of Paiute Ponds, Rancho Sierra Golf Course. You're starting to get a few records in the breeding season in LA County, plus a few more in Orange County, and so on. Not all necessarily pertaining to breeding birds, but certainly potentially so. If you look at the most recent 6-year period, and remember these orange pins are within the last month or so, things have really exploded now. So you've got several sites in the Antelope Valley from Crystal Air to Pear Blossom Park. You've got Paiute Ponds area, Rancho Sierra Golf Course, the Western Antelope Valley, a couple sites around Castaic. You've got Hanson, well, you've got several areas in the San Fernando Valley, Sepulveda, several in the LA Basin, along this lower San Gabriel River, and of course going out here toward Glendora, Santa Fe Dam, Whittier Narrows. So they've really occupied a number of sites just really within the last 5 to 6 years. This is just a slide for that entire period starting in 2003 of wintertime, December to February observations. And you can see they're actually even a little more widespread in the winter when there is some movement, expansion, and movement into the coastal slope. Probably a little bit of movement away from the deserts as well. So they are partially migratory or sort of short distance migrants, but they do tend to be a little more widespread in the wintertime. So is it real? There's always a but. That same period, of course, has seen an explosion in the number of birders, as well as the efficiency of learning about what birders have found by posting an eBird, by communicating through social media, and so on. And so you always have to ask that question, is this increase real, or could it just be that there are more of us out looking? Now, I think even a 1970s birder who's nowhere near as sophisticated as all of you would probably recognize a male vermilion flycatcher. I don't think it's a tough ID issue. This really is a clear range expansion. But are they nesting? We know they're here in the breeding season. This is actually a female that was sitting on a nest this spring in Pear Blossom Park. They hatched 2 young. I think the young probably got gobbled by ravens or something, because the adults are still around, but they never were seen with fledged young birds. But anyway, we know we have several proven nesting records now. It's interesting that essentially all of the nests that have been found in LA County are in non-native trees and in really sort of artificial situations, artificially irrigated parks, golf courses, cemeteries, rather than natural riparian. One of the only exceptions was the first nest in 1994 that Dick Erickson found was in a cottonwood in sort of a riparian area in the Leona Valley. Vermilion flycatchers build their nest in a fork of a tree limb or major branches. They don't use mud like the somewhat ecologically similar phoebes, and they nest up in trees. It may just be a couple meters up, but usually 3, 4, 5, 8 meters up in a tree. No shortage of nesting opportunities, certainly. So here are just some examples of recent confirmed nestings in LA County. So El Dorado Park this year, adults feeding young. Leg Lake out in Whittier Narrows area, they nested this year, a fledgling seen with adults. Santa Fe Dam, the last 2 years has documented nesting, juveniles, copulation. The Rosedale Angeles Cemetery, which is in the urban core of LA near Normandy in Washington, so right off the 10 freeway. Brad Rumbles documented breeding there last year in 2019. Oakdale Memorial Park or Cemetery in Glendora is a well-known area. In fact, Rick Fisher, who birds there a lot, thinks there may be as many as 3 pairs nesting there, and he's found juveniles and fledglings the last couple of years there. Valhalla Memorial Park, yet another cemetery in Burbank, breeding documented last year in 2019. Up in the Castaic area at the sports complex there, breeding was documented in 2018. And as I mentioned, in Pear Blossom Park, both last year and this year, there was definite nesting. This is not necessarily a complete list, but it shows you that in the last 3 years, breeding by vermilion flycatchers has been more than just sort of a one-off rare thing. So is it an urban adapted species? Will it sort of become a black phoebe? I'm not saying that, but they do seem to do okay in some irrigated urban parks that have trees and open lawns and things. It's a very common bird in a lot of cities in the neotropics. So, for example, if you go to Lima, Peru, you're going to see them right in the middle of downtown, and a lot of the birds, most of them are going to look like this. This is this subspecies obscurus, where many of the males are this dark, sort of dusky-looking morph. So why this expansion? What's going on? Well, we don't know, of course. That's the main answer, but it's instructive to note the habitats they're using, which again are urban and suburban, in some cases rural parks, golf courses, cemeteries, things that have artificial watering, open lawns, and planted trees of various sizes, from saplings on up to tall trees. Lots of large-scale irrigation. They may be aided by climate change. This is a bird that exists in extremely hot habitats through much of its neotropical range. So as winters get warmer and summers get hotter, it's probably not a problem for vermilion flycatchers and might even somehow benefit them. We have no idea, but there could be some subtle changes through habitat modification of the kinds of things they like to eat, the abundance and identity of arthropod prey. That's a hard thing to study, but it certainly might be a factor. Of course, the other possible reason is that they haven't expanded. There's just more birders. And the only way to really look at that would be to somehow weight the sightings and the distribution to the birder effort. And you can do that with eBird. I just didn't bother doing that this time around. But I just really don't think it's simply a matter of birder abundance. So you guys out there, how can you help unravel the mystery of what's going on? And the most important thing is just to get out in the field, continue to gather sightings, to post them on eBird. This is how nowadays we're learning about these things. But let me add something that I know I've been harping on a lot, which is don't just put the sighting into eBird, but add annotations, both in the general comments in your checklist about your surveying efforts and in the species account under Vermilion Flycatcher. Give the details of what you've observed. If you're finding a nest, what is the evidence? Where is the nest? What kind of tree? How high up? What were the birds doing? And so on. Include all this kind of natural history information in your eBird reports. This is something that we have really gotten away from, and I think it's very disappointing. If you go back 100 years, scientists in California, say involved with the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in Berkeley or others, would write extensive notes. They would spend hours in the evening detailing exactly what they had seen. And these notes are very useful now as we try to compare what was going on then till now. But I'm afraid we're leaving a very fragmentary record, because basically we're putting a number next to the species name and putting it into eBird with no other information. So please get into the habit of including more natural history details in your eBird submissions, or recording that information some other way. Nesting phenology, when are they nesting? I gave some dates of the proven nestings in the last 3 years, and you can see it's basically May through July, which is not surprising. But let's learn more about nesting phenology, the details of the nest sites, and how successful they are. What are they eating? You can watch foraging birds and get some idea of at least where they're capturing prey, even if you don't know what they're capturing. And also, if you do find breeding birds, follow up in subsequent years, because are we just seeing little, 1 year unsuccessful attempts, or even successful, but just sort of short-term attempts of occupying an area? Or are they becoming established and breeding year after year? So it's nice to follow up on that kind of thing. So I encourage you to do all of that. And I thank you for listening. This is, again, just a very superficial overview of a trend that we're seeing. We could talk about many other species that are either getting more numerous or getting rarer, and talk about the data and why this might be happening. But I just, maybe because Vermilion Flycatchers are just kind of good looking, I thought it would be a fun thing to talk about in this initial LA Birders Zoom meeting. So thank you. Maybe you can't see me. I hope you could hear me, or I at least hope you could see my slides. And thanks again to Ron and Mark for setting this up, and we can see about questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can look at the questions, if that's okay.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kimball. While questions come rolling in, we already have a couple of questions. First question is, someone noticed on one of your slides a July breeding record and a May breeding record. Does that indicate that Vermilion Flycatchers might actually breed twice during the season?
That's a good question. It wouldn't shock me. I think it might be more likely that it's a case where an initial attempt failed for some reason, and that they are attempting a second brood after not having been successful the first time. So for example, at Pear Blossom Park this year, the male and female showed up in the early spring. They built a nest. They had 2 young. The young apparently never fledged. The male and female are still hanging around. The male's still displaying. I suspect they're going to try again. So yeah, the July records seem pretty late. The basic answer is we don't know whether they have been double brooded, or whether perhaps more likely it was a failed first attempt followed by a second attempt.
Oh, great, thanks. Another question we have is, are males the only ones that raise their crest, or do females do that as well?
Beats me. I think we notice it more in males because the crest is bright red, but I don't know why a female vermilion flycatcher wouldn't be able to do the same thing. I suspect, and I'll have to. I actually get to go into the museum tomorrow for the first time in a little while. One could look at specimens and look at the length of the crest or crown feathers and see if there's actually a difference. Maybe females don't have as long a set of feathers to raise. I don't know. How's that for an answer?
That sounds pretty good to us. One of the other questions is, how many eggs are in an average vermilion flycatcher nest? Do you know?
Um, hold on. This is a great book, The Birder's Handbook. I'm guessing probably 3. I'm also guessing that maybe clutch size is smaller in the tropical parts of their range. I don't know that for sure. All I know is I saw 2 nestlings in the nest in Pear Blossom Park, so whether there were more than 2 eggs, I don't know. According to the Birder's Handbook, the range is 2 to 4, and the most common clutch size is 3.
That sounds great. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? By the way, we've ranged in participants or attendees from about 58 to 64. So we have a pretty good crowd out there. Are there any other questions? And one just popped in. The question is there any concern about posting nesting information on eBird?
I'd be concerned if people didn't, because I think it's good information. We live in an age where there's kind of a scourge out there of bird photographers, and I don't mean birders who are photographers, but I mean bird photographers whose whole goal is simply to get photos and have no interest in birds or ornithology otherwise. That's always a problem, but I think it's more important to get this information and document it. Yeah, I wouldn't do it for really sensitive species, but I think that maybe the vermilion flycatcher is not of so much special concern as we used to think. Um, I would also add, going back to a previous question, I noticed that Brittany mentioned in the chat that out at Cal State San Bernardino, where vermilion flycatchers have been nesting for several years now, they can be double brooded. They can raise young or bring off young as late as August. So it may not be that rare a thing.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And thanks for the chat. Does anyone have any other questions while we have Kimball on the line? Or while we have Mark on the line as well? And seeing none in either, I'm sorry, Kimball. And the question is, are the dark morphs ever found further north? Is the question.
Yeah, I see that from Allison, who's very much into bright red birds and colorful birds, but bird plumage in general. It's, as far as I know, it's limited to the subspecies obscurus, which is basically on the coastal side of the Andes in Peru. There's a number of related subspecies from southern Peru, probably even northern Chile, on up to the Tumbesian region. So I don't know if those have dark morphs, but I think from what I've read, I think it's pretty localized in the Lima area and that coastal part of central Peru. And I don't know if the genetics have been looked at. It's really interesting that it's a very common plumage there. Hard to know what the adaptive advantage is if your whole social life is built around being glowing red. how do you become successful by being dull dark brown? I don't know, but it's a really interesting question that I don't know the answer to.
And John Veenstra mentioned that he has never seen a dark morph, I guess, in Ecuador. So I guess they don't get as high as Ecuador.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Kim
I
Moore
think it's
asks,
basically Peru.
okay. Kim Moore asks, are you finding iNaturalist of any use for birds or just another place to put photos for birds?
Good question about iNaturalist. You know, we've talked about eBird a lot. I think iNaturalist is fantastic. I spend a lot of time doing identifications. I use it a lot to put in non-bird things, partly because there's a great community of people out there who can make identifications and confirm them and eventually be correct about it. So I can find out what some of these things are that I don't know how to identify. Not birds, but some of the other things. Now, in terms of getting natural history information, that iNaturalist tends to be basically just photos without a lot of additional information. But certainly you can look for photos of juveniles or of adults feeding juveniles and so on. This is not a bird topic, but our curator of herpetology at the Natural History Museum, Greg Pauly, has been using iNaturalist submissions to look at the mating behavior of southern alligator lizards, which is a very common lizard all through urban Los Angeles and Southern California. Yet there were very, very few documented cases of mating in alligator lizards. In fact, well, the person who published the only paper about known copulations, had never even seen it himself. He published something based on other people's observations. Um, Greg decided we can use iNaturalist, encourage people to go out and get photos. And of course, if you're out getting photos and you see copulating alligator lizards, you're gonna, be all over it and take photos and put it on there. So I forget the numbers, but he's had dozens and dozens of instances of alligator lizard copulations, being able to look at the phenology of it and all sorts of information that simply wasn't known at all from community scientists who had no training other than going out with a camera and taking pictures. So I'm not saying that most bird species are that poorly known in terms of those kinds of behaviors, but if you, as the iNaturalist database grows, I think you're going to find that going through it and looking for um, interesting submissions that confirm some kind of behavior will be really worthwhile. I know that we're very interested in using that to look at pintail white parasitism of munias and potentially other species, because people tend to get photos of things like that. And we're not only using iNaturalist for it, but if you advertise things right, I mean, around Valentine's Day at the museum, that we put out a whole bunch of publicity about go out and look for alligator lizards making love, and that really caused a big boom in the data points that Greg was able to get. So we can, if you have a project and advertise it, it's amazing how the response is. So I'm all in on iNaturalist for that kind of thing.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to thank Kimball Garrett and Mark Shield for presenting for us tonight. This, I hope, is going to be the first of many webinars that are being presented to LA birders. And in the meantime, if you're going out birding, please stay safe and stay about 6 feet away with a mask, and unless you happen to see copulating vermilion flycatchers, in that case, yell it out, please. And with that, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone attending. Mark, did you have anything else that before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank everybody for attending, and I'd also like to thank um, Frank and Susan Goland and Katie Mann and Janet Scheel and Eileen Burton for also helping organize this. And certainly thank Kimball for agreeing to speak.
Yes.
And thanks
Thank
to all
you.
of you for being part of it.
And and everybody else, if you have any feedback to send us, just drop us an email if you're interested to. We hope to do more of these, and that would be so I'm gung ho in doing more, and I hope that other people are interested as well.
And with that, thank you all very much. And again, thank you, Kimball. We really appreciate it. See you all next time.